Welcome back. We have looked at research questions, the types of research questions. So now let's move on to hypothesis. Hypothesis can be looked at as statements of opinion that are testable. You create the hypothesis from your research question. Remember, there are testable research questions and there are non-testable research questions. So if you have a testable research question, you must turn it to hypothesis. That becomes the argument of your work. Hypothesis, the argument of your thesis, the thesis of your work. So they are quite simple to change. Okay, where you're saying, is there a relationship between so and so, you can turn it to hypothesis by saying there is a relationship between so and so. So you have turned the question to a hypothesis. Okay, so, and at the end of it, where you have the question mark, you turn it to a full stop. There are 7 characteristics of a good research hypothesis. You must be able to clearly identify what is the dependent and what is the independent variable to be studied. So, what is the part that is dependent? Okay, the independent variable explains the dependent variable. Why the dependent variable is the variable that is being explained by the independent variable. Okay, so from your work, it should be clear. At times it may not be clear, but you should be able to identify which one is explaining which one to a certain extent. You should specify the nature of the relationship that exists between those two. Are you trying to look for association? Are you looking for differences? So in your hypothesis, this must be clear. It must also be simple enough. Remember, if your questions are simple and clear, then your hypothesis should also be simple and clear. You do not need to include the specific terms of measure. So do not state a research hypothesis by saying there is a correlation between. No, it is not appropriate. You can say there is an association between A and B. You do not need to state that there is a correlation between A and B. Do also not refer to a specific statistical technique that is similar to what I just stated earlier. Do not include reference to specific measures, and do not include any statistical procedure that you are going to use in stating your research hypothesis. You must also indicate the population that you are going to study. So there is a statistically significant relationship between so and so in Obiakpo local government. There is no statistically significant, there is a relationship, or there are differences between upland and riverine household in relation to their socioeconomic status in River State. So there must be a focus or a statement or an indication about the population of study. The research hypothesis must be falsifiable, which means it can be proven false, which means there must be data that you are going to collect to show whether it is true, or the hypothesis that you have stated, whether it can be retained, whether the null hypothesis can be retained, or we have to retain, we reject the null hypothesis, or we're going to retain the alternative hypothesis. So these are the 4 essential attributes of a good hypothesis. Have in mind, your research question creates your hypothesis. So your testable research question leads to your hypothesis. Non-testable research question requires no hypothesis. So if you have non-testable research question, you do not need hypothesis because you are not going to subject it to statistical testing. So let's look at an example turning research question to hypothesis. Is there a statistically significant relationship between the location of respondents' house and their perception of municipal waste management in Choba? So we're trying to see whether where people live affects their opinion or perception of municipal waste management. If we want to turn that directly to a research hypothesis, there is a statistically significant relationship between location of respondents' house and their perception of municipal waste management in Choba. You can see all we did was to move the is in right before the there in the research question, and we remove the question mark at the end of the statement. The second example, is there a statistically significant difference between upland and riverine respondents in River State with respect to environmental problems facing their community? There is a statistically significant difference between upland and riverine respondents in River State with respect to environmental problems facing their community. So that is how you turn the research question. Okay, you turn the research question here and here, as well as here and here. You turn it to hypothesis. These hypotheses, this one and this one, they are what we refer to as the alternative hypothesis. Okay, we are going to get to the null hypothesis later, but these are the alternative hypotheses. They are the opposite of null hypothesis. So, what are the rule of thumb? It is better to have several simple hypotheses than one very complicated one. Limit the number of hypotheses in your study to fewer than 6. Because when it gets too many, then it becomes a little bit too much to do within the period of time that you have to carry out the research. Very important also that you do not have to have a formal hypothesis for all the comparison or statistical procedure you are going to use in your work. At times, you might not have stated any hypothesis for a particular statistical test, but in the process of doing your work, you realize that it might be interesting or it might be necessary to carry out a particular statistical technique. You need to do that. So you don't have to have a hypothesis for every single statistical test that you are going to do in your work. Report any statistical finding that you feel are relevant, whether you have an hypothesis for them or you do not have a hypothesis for them. As long as they are relevant in helping you to explain your findings, do make reference to them and highlight them in your work. Finally, remember, this is very important. Okay? Don't ever think that because you could not find any statistical significance, it means that your work is invalid. No. Because you do not find statistical significance in terms of difference or association or relationship, it doesn't mean that your work is irrelevant. It means that you have probably found something that it was against or contrary to what everyone believed. Or note also, it might be that your circumstances, the circumstances of the place or the time of your data collection was totally different from what has been observed in literature. So do not fret or get apprehensive whenever you find something that is contrary to what other people have stated in literature. It might present an opportunity for you to look critically at something that everybody has accepted as the norm and come up with something totally different.